The grease under her fingernails wasn't from changing bandages. It was from dismantling an empire, one handful of sand at a time. Lyon, France, November 1943, 11:47 p.m. Virginie d'Albert-Lac stood on Platform 6 of the Perrache railway station, her Red Cross armband the only thing keeping her alive. Around her, the night shift of German soldiers moved like shadows, boots echoing on concrete, rifles slung across shoulders, cigarette smoke curling into the frozen air. They didn't look at her. Why would they? She was just another French nurse, cleaning up their messes, patching their wounded, invisible in her utility. That invisibility was about to become the most dangerous weapon in occupied France. Above her head, the station clock ticked past midnight. Right on schedule, the low rumble of an approaching locomotive shook the platform. Virginie felt it in her chest before she heard it. A deep, mechanical growl that announced the arrival of Convoy 447, a German supply train carrying 40 tons of munitions, medical supplies, and replacement parts for Panzer tanks fighting on the Eastern Front. She had watched trains like this pass through Lyon every night for 6 months. Watched them roll east toward the front lines, carrying the tools of war that would kill Allied soldiers, crush resistance fighters, and extend the Nazi occupation for another year, another month, another blood-soaked day. And every night she had done nothing. Tonight was different. Virginie adjusted the medical bag on her shoulder and walked toward the edge of the platform, where a cluster of wounded German soldiers sat waiting for the hospital transport. She knelt beside a young private with a bandaged leg, offering him water from her canteen. He thanked her in broken French. She smiled, played the part, and while his eyes were on her face, her free hand slipped into her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around a small glass bottle, no larger than a medicine vial. Inside, 3 tablespoons of coarse sand, collected that afternoon from the banks of the Rhone River. It didn't look like much. It didn't feel like a weapon. But 2 weeks ago, an old railway mechanic named Michel had pulled her aside in the station's maintenance shed and whispered a secret that had been eating at him for months. "You want to stop the trains?" he had said, his voice barely audible over the clang of metal on metal. "You don't need explosives. You don't need guns. You need sand." Virginie had stared at him, certain he was joking or drunk or both. Michel had grabbed a wrench and held it up. "Every train wheel sits on a bearing, smooth, oiled, perfect. Drop a handful of sand into the bearing housing, and friction does the rest. The train will run fine for 50, maybe 60 kilometers. Then the bearing seizes. The axle snaps. The whole thing derails or grinds to a halt in the middle of nowhere." He had leaned closer, his breath smelling of cheap wine and desperation. No explosion, no fire, just a mechanical failure. The Germans blame the cold weather, the old equipment, bad maintenance. They never suspect sabotage. Virginie had walked away that night without answering. She wasn't a saboteur. She was a nurse. She had taken an oath to heal, not to destroy. But that was before she saw the cattle cars. 3 days ago, a train had passed through Lyon, carrying not munitions, but people. Jewish families from the countryside, crammed into boxcars, their hands pressed against the slats, their voices calling out for water, for mercy, for God. The German guards had laughed, smoked, and waved the train through without stopping. Virginie had stood on the platform, holding a bucket of water she wasn't allowed to give, and something inside her had broken. No more watching, No more waiting. Now, as Convoy 447 hissed and groaned to a stop in front of her, Virginie stood and moved along the platform, weaving between soldiers and cargo crates. She approached the rear axle assembly of the third freight car, crouching as if to tie her shoe. The soldiers were 20 meters away, focused on loading crates. Her hand trembled as she unscrewed the cap of the vial. The sand inside looked harmless, almost laughable. She thought of Michelle's words, 50 kilometers. Then chaos. She poured the sand into the narrow gap between the wheel housing and the axle, tapping the vial to make sure every grain fell. The sand disappeared into the machinery, like a ghost slipping through a locked door. Virginie stood, slipped the empty vial back into her pocket, and walked calmly toward the station exit. Her heartbeat hammered in her ears, but her face remained neutral, professional, bored. Just another night shift. Just another train. Behind her, the locomotive's whistle screamed. The convoy lurched forward, metal grinding against metal, and rolled out of the station into the black French countryside. Virginie didn't look back. She walked out into the freezing November night, crossed the empty square, and sat down on a bench near the fountain. Her hands were shaking so badly, she had to clasp them together to stop the trembling. What had she just done? She had committed sabotage against the German army. If they caught her, they wouldn't send her to prison. They would line her up against a wall and shoot her in the head, just like they had done to the baker on Rue de la République last month for hiding a British pilot. But worse than the fear was the waiting. Would it work? Or had she just thrown sand into a machine for nothing? 53 kilometers outside Lyon, at 1:42 a.m., the third freight car of Convoy 447 began to smoke. The bearing inside the rear axle, now filled with abrasive grit, was overheating. The sand acted like sandpaper, grinding away at the smooth metal surfaces that were designed to spin freely. Friction generated heat. Heat generated more friction. The axle began to glow red in the darkness. The engineer in the locomotive felt nothing. The soldiers in the passenger cars heard nothing. But the metal was screaming. At 1:51 a.m., the bearing seized completely. The wheel locked mid-rotation. The axle, unable to turn, snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The freight car lurched sideways, dragging the cars behind it off the tracks. 40 tons of munitions and machinery tipped over, spilling across the rail line like a broken toy. The train ground to a halt, its cargo scattered across the frozen countryside. German soldiers poured out of the cars, shouting orders, rifles raised, searching for partisans, for explosives, for an enemy that wasn't there. The commanding officer inspected the wreckage with a flashlight. He saw the twisted axle, the shattered bearing, the black streaks of overheated metal. "Verdammte alte Scheiße," he muttered. "Damn old junk." He wrote in his report, "Mechanical failure due to substandard French rail equipment. No enemy action suspected." Back in Lyon, Virginie d'Alberlac lay awake in her narrow bed in the nurse's dormitory. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her roommate's breathing, wondering if the train had made it to the front lines, or if Michel's crazy plan had actually worked. She would not know until morning, when the railway workers whispered the news through the station like a forbidden prayer. Convoy 447 derailed, 50 kilometers east, no survivors in the cargo, total loss. When Virginie heard it, she did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply walked to the riverbank that afternoon, filled another vial with sand, and slipped it into her coat pocket. One train down. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in 2 years of occupation, Virginie d'Albert-Lac had stopped being a witness. She had become a weapon. The second train didn't feel like luck. It felt like murder. Virginie had watched the wreckage reports trickle in through the railway workers' network for 3 days after Convoy 447 derailed. No casualties, they said, just cargo loss, delays, angry officers screaming at engineers. But when she closed her eyes at night, she saw the freight cars tipping over in slow motion. Imagined the soldiers inside thrown against metal walls, bones snapping, skulls cracking against steel. She told herself they were the enemy. She told herself every train she stopped meant fewer Allied pilots shot down, fewer French Jews loaded into cattle cars, fewer months of occupation. But the guilt sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy. Michel found her on the 4th night, standing alone on the platform long after her shift had ended, staring at the empty tracks. "You did it," he said quietly, lighting a cigarette. His hands were stained black with engine grease, his face lined with exhaustion. "I heard the Germans blame it on French incompetence. They're replacing the axles on 50 trains this week. That's 50 trains not carrying ammunition to the Eastern Front." Virginie didn't answer. She was watching a German supply convoy rolling slowly into the station. Convoy 502, according to the manifest she had seen earlier. 40 rail cars, carrying winter uniforms, medical supplies, and replacement tank treads for the panzer divisions fighting near Stalingrad. "How many more?" she asked. Michel exhaled smoke into the frozen air. "How many more what? How many more trains do I have to stop before it makes a difference?" He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes dark and tired. "All of them," he said. "You stop all of them." The problem with sand, Virginie quickly learned, was that it required proximity. She couldn't just throw it from a distance or drop it from a bridge. She had to get close. Close enough to crouch beside the wheel housing, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the machinery, close enough for a guard to spot her if they turned their head at the wrong moment. Michel became her teacher in the art of invisibility. He showed her the blind spots in the station's security patrols, the times when guards changed shifts and attention wandered. He taught her to move like she belonged, to carry her medical bag as if she were always rushing to help someone, to never hesitate or look guilty. "The moment you act suspicious," he told her, "you're dead. So don't act suspicious. Act bored, act tired, act like you've done this 1,000 times before." She practiced on empty trains during the day, timing how long it took to reach the axle, pour the sand, and walk away without breaking stride. 12 seconds. That was her window. Any longer, and someone would notice. By the end of November, she had developed a system. She collected sand from different locations around Lyon, the riverbank, construction sites, the park near the cathedral, so no single location would run out and draw suspicion. She stored it in small medical vials labeled with fake drug names: morphine solution, penicillin powder, sulfa compound. If anyone searched her bag, they would see exactly what a nurse should be carrying. She kept a mental map of which trains were most valuable. Munitions convoys got priority. Supply trains carrying food to German garrisons came second. Troop transports were too risky. Too many soldiers. Too many eyes. The second derailment happened on December 3rd, 67 kilometers outside Lyon. Convoy 502, the winter uniform shipment, ground to a halt when its rear axle seized and snapped. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius that night, and Virginie wondered if the cold had made the metal more brittle, more likely to fail. The Germans blamed the weather. The third derailment was on December 11th, the fourth on December 18th. By Christmas, the Lion station was in chaos. German officers were screaming at French railway engineers, demanding explanations. Inspections became mandatory. Every train was checked before departure. Soldiers crawling underneath the cars with flashlights, looking for explosives, for loose bolts, for anything that might cause another accident. Virginie watched the new security measures roll out and realized her window was closing. If she was going to continue, she would have to adapt. The solution came from an unexpected source, a teenage boy named Etienne, who worked as a luggage porter on the platform. He approached her one evening after her shift, his cap pulled low over his eyes. "I know what you're doing," he whispered. Virginie's blood turned to ice. Her hand moved instinctively toward the vial in her pocket, ready to throw it away, to run, to deny everything. But Etienne held up his hands. "I want to help." She stared at him. He couldn't have been more than 16, thin and gangly, with a faint shadow of a mustache that he clearly thought made him look older. "You're insane," she said flatly. "Maybe," he replied. "But I'm also invisible. Nobody looks at the luggage boy. I can get closer to the trains than you ever could." He had a point. Etienne's job required him to load cargo, check manifests, move equipment around the platform. He could kneel beside a wheel housing to tie his shoe, and no one would think twice. Virginie studied his face, searching for signs of a trap, a Gestapo plant, a fool who would get them both killed. But all she saw was a kid who was tired of being powerless, tired of watching German boots march through his city while he carried their luggage like a servant. "If you get caught," she said quietly, "they will torture you. They will make you give me up, and then they will shoot both of us." Etienne nodded. "I know." "And you still want to do this?" "My father was killed at Dunkirk," he said. "My mother starves herself so my little sister can eat. The Germans took our house and turned it into officer quarters. So yes, I still want to do this." Virginie handed him a vial of sand. 12 seconds, she said. "Pour it. Walk away. Forget it ever happened." He grinned, a fierce, reckless grin that reminded her of the pilots she had seen shot down over France, the ones who climbed back into their planes even after they knew the odds. The next night, Etienne sabotaged his first train, then a second, then a third. By January, they had recruited 2 more railway workers, an elderly ticket clerk named Simone and a track maintenance worker named Claude. Together they formed a cell, operating independently, never meeting as a group, communicating only through coded messages left in a hollowed-out brick near the station's north entrance. Virginie called them les grains de sable, the grains of sand. Michel thought it was funny. Etienne thought it sounded like a children's game. Simone said it didn't matter what they called themselves, as long as the trains kept crashing. And they did. By February 1944, 8 German supply trains had derailed within a 100-kilometer radius of Lyon. The German High Command was furious. They executed 2 French railway engineers as scapegoats, hanging their bodies from lampposts near the station as a warning. Virginie saw the bodies on her way to work. She forced herself to look, to remember their faces, to carry the weight of what her actions had cost. That night, she filled 3 more vials with sand. Because Michel was right. She couldn't stop now. She had to stop all of them, even if it killed her, even if it already had. The Gestapo doesn't knock. They kick the door off its hinges at 4 a.m. and drag you into the street in your nightgown, while your neighbors pretend to sleep. Virginie learned this on the morning of February 14, 1944, when they came for Simone. She heard about it third hand, whispered through the network like a prayer for the dead. Simone, the elderly ticket clerk, who had sabotaged 3 trains in 6 weeks, had been arrested at her apartment near the Croix-Rousse district. Someone had informed, a neighbor, a co-worker, maybe just a stranger who noticed her moving too deliberately around the train platforms, lingering too long near the wheel assemblies. The details were sparse, but the conclusion was clear. Simone was in the basement of the Gestapo headquarters on Avenue Berthelot, and no one who went into that building came out unchanged. Virginie stood in the nurse's dormitory bathroom at 6 a.m., staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her face looked gaunt, older than her 28 years. The dark circles under her eyes had become permanent. Her hands, scrubbed raw from washing medical equipment and hiding vials of sand, trembled as she gripped the edge of the sink. She had 2 choices: run or keep working, and pray Simone didn't break under torture. Running meant abandoning the network, abandoning Michel and Etienne and Claude, abandoning every train that would roll east carrying ammunition to kill Allied soldiers. Running meant survival, but it also meant surrender. Virginie splashed cold water on her face, tied her hair back, pinned her Red Cross armband to her coat, and walked to the station. If they were coming for her, let them come while she was still fighting. The Gestapo had transformed the Lyon railway station into a surveillance grid. Virginie noticed it the moment she arrived for her shift. Plainclothes officers lingered near the ticket booths, watching the crowd with predatory focus. German soldiers had doubled their patrols, walking in pairs, rifles unslung, checking papers at random. A new guard tower had been erected overlooking Platform 6, manned by an SS sniper with a clear line of sight across the entire station. Michel found her in the supply closet, his face pale and drawn. "Simone hasn't talked," he whispered. "Not yet. But they're tearing the station apart. They know something's happening here. They just don't know what." "How long do we have?" Virginie asked. Michel shook his head. "Hours. Maybe less. If Simone gives them even a single name." "Then we stop," Virginie interrupted. "We shut down. We scatter. We wait for the heat to die down." "And the trains?" Virginie looked through the crack in the door at Platform 6, where Convoy 621 was being loaded with medical supplies destined for German field hospitals on the Eastern Front. Plasma, morphine, surgical kits, everything needed to keep German soldiers alive long enough to kill more Allied troops. "The trains keep rolling," she said. "That's the problem." Michel grabbed her arm. "You can't be serious. They're hunting us. If you go out there tonight, then I go out there and do my job," Virginie said, pulling her arm free. "Because if we stop, they win." At 11:37 p.m., under a sky choked with winter clouds, Virginie walked onto Platform 6 for what might be the last time. The station was quieter than usual. Most of the civilian workers had been sent home early due to the increased security. Only essential personnel remained: German soldiers, railway engineers, and medical staff like Virginie, who were required to be on standby in case of accidents. Convoy 621 sat on the tracks like a sleeping beast, 40 cars of war machinery waiting to roll east. Virginie counted 6 guards patrolling the length of the train, twice the normal number. The sniper in the tower tracked her with his rifle scope as she moved across the platform. She forced herself to walk normally, to check on the wounded soldiers waiting near the station's medical tent, to play the role she had perfected over 3 months. The dedicated nurse, exhausted and apolitical, too tired to care about anything except bandages and morphine doses. But in her coat pocket, her fingers closed around a vial of sand. The guards changed shifts at midnight. Virginie had timed it dozens of times. There was a 3-minute gap when the outgoing patrol overlapped with the incoming one, creating a brief moment of confusion as men exchanged cigarettes and complaints about the cold. At 11:58 p.m., she positioned herself near the rear of the train, pretending to inventory medical supplies in a storage crate. She counted the seconds in her head, her heartbeat hammering so loudly she was sure the guards could hear it. Midnight. The patrol shifted. Men turned their backs. Conversations rose and fell. Virginie moved. 12 seconds. She had 12 seconds. She dropped to one knee beside the wheel housing of the 9th freight car, unscrewing the vial cap as she moved. The sand poured out in a thin stream, disappearing into the gap between metal and axle. She didn't breathe, didn't think. Just poured and stood and walked. 10 seconds. She was 3 meters away when a voice barred through the night. "Halt! Was machst du da? Halt! What are you doing there?" Virginie froze. A German corporal was striding toward her, rifle raised, his face twisted with suspicion. Her mind raced. Running meant guilt. Silence meant guilt. She had one chance to sell the lie. She turned, holding up her medical bag with shaking hands. "Ich habe meine Tasche fallen lassen," she said in broken German. "I dropped my bag. Entschuldigung. Sorry." The corporal stopped 2 meters away, his rifle still pointed at her chest. He looked at the bag, then at her face, then at the ground where she had been kneeling. "Was es da?" he demanded, gesturing with his rifle toward the wheel housing. "What's there?" "Nichts," Virginie said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Nothing. Ich bin nur müde. I'm just tired." The corporal stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. He was young, maybe 22, with a thin face and nervous hands. He looked like he wanted to believe her, wanted this to be nothing, wanted to go back to his warm post and forget he ever saw a French nurse acting suspicious near a train that would derail in 60 kilometers. But he didn't lower his rifle. Instead, he called over his shoulder. "Feldwebel, come here." "Sergeant, come here." Virginie's stomach dropped. If they searched her bag, they would find the vials. If they questioned her, someone would remember seeing her near other trains that had derailed. If they dragged her to Avenue Berthelot, she would end up in the same basement as Simone. And she didn't know if she was strong enough to stay silent under the kind of pain the Gestapo specialized in. The sergeant approached, older and harder, his face carved from stone. He looked at Virginie with the flat, dead eyes of a man who had seen too much war to care about the difference between guilty and innocent. "Papier," he said. "Papers." Virginie handed over her identification card with trembling hands. The sergeant studied it under his flashlight, comparing her face to the photo. "Red Cross," he said in French, his accent thick. "You work here long?" "6 months," Virginie replied. "You see anything strange tonight? Anyone acting suspicious?" She met his eyes, forcing herself not to look away. "No, monsieur. Only soldiers and trains." The sergeant stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then he handed back her papers and turned to the corporal. Sie ist sauber. Lass sie gehen. She's clean. Let her go. The corporal hesitated, then lowered his rifle. Virginie walked away, her legs shaking so badly she thought she might collapse. She made it to the station exit, through the square, around the corner, and into a dark alley before she doubled over and vomited into the gutter. She had survived. Barely. But 60 kilometers east, Convoy 621 was already rolling into the night, carrying its invisible poison toward the front lines. Virginie wiped her mouth, straightened her coat, and walked home through the frozen streets of Lyon. Tomorrow, she would do it again. Because the alternative, stopping, surrendering, letting the trains roll unchallenged, was a kind of death she couldn't accept. Even if the Gestapo was closing in, even if Simone's screams were echoing through the basement on Avenue Berthelot at that very moment, even if Virginie d'Alberlac was next. Simone died on February 21st, and the resistance died with her, or so the Gestapo thought. They found her body hanging in her cell at Avenue Berthelot, a crude suicide staged to look like guilt. But the railway workers knew the truth. Simone had been beaten for 7 days straight, and when she still wouldn't talk, they killed her and called it shame. The Gestapo leaked word to the station. We know about the sabotage. We know there's a network. Give us names, or you're next. Virginie stood at Simone's funeral, a quiet, hurried affair with 6 mourners, and no priest willing to risk association. She stared at the cheap wooden coffin and made herself a promise. Simone's silence had bought them time. Virginie would not waste it. By March 1944, the rhythm of war had shifted. Everyone could feel it. The Allied bombers flew overhead almost daily now, hitting German positions, factories, and railway hubs across France. The Americans were fighting their way up through Italy. The Soviets were crushing the Eastern Front. And in London, plans were being drawn for an invasion that would either liberate France or drown the English Channel in Allied blood. But in Lyon, the trains kept rolling. Convoy after convoy, night after night, carrying the machinery of occupation east toward the crumbling front lines. Virginie and her network, now reduced to just Michel, Etienne, and Claude, kept sabotaging them with sand. Each derailment a small, invisible act of defiance that the Germans blamed on equipment failure, cold weather, or French incompetence. By the end of April, they had stopped 14 trains. And then, on the morning of June 5, 1944, everything changed. Michel found Virginie in the supply closet, his face flushed with something she hadn't seen in months. Hope. "Turn on the radio," he whispered. "The BBC. They're broadcasting the codes." Virginie didn't understand. What codes? The invasion codes. The Allies are coming. It's happening. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, covered in scribbled phrases. These were the prearranged signals the French resistance had been waiting for, broadcast over BBC radio, to activate coordinated sabotage operations across the country. "Plan vert," Michel said, his voice trembling. "Railway sabotage. We're supposed to cut every rail line between here and the coast. They want the Germans trapped, unable to reinforce Normandy when the invasion starts." Virginie's heart hammered. This wasn't small-scale disruption anymore. This was total war. "How many trains?" she asked. "All of them," Michel said. "Every single one." That night, Virginie sat in the dormitory, with the radio pressed to her ear, listening to the BBC French service broadcast its cryptic messages into the occupied darkness. "Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne," the voice said. the long sobs of autumn violins. Then, hours later, blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone, wound my heart with a monotonous languor. It was Verlaine's poem, The Signal. The invasion was imminent. Virginie stood, her legs unsteady. Across Lyon, across all of France, thousands of resistance fighters were receiving the same message. Railway workers were loosening bolts on tracks. Partisans were planting explosives under bridges. And in the Lyon station, Virginie d'Alberlac was preparing to sabotage the most important train of her life. June 6, 1944. D-Day. While Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German High Command in Lyon scrambled to respond. Orders flew down from Berlin. Reinforce the coast, crush the invasion, throw the Allies back into the sea. At 9 p.m., Convoy 880 arrived at the Lyon station, an emergency troop transport carrying an entire SS Panzer Division from the Eastern Front, diverted west to smash the Allied beachhead. 40 freight cars packed with tanks, armored vehicles, ammunition, and 2,500 battle-hardened soldiers who had survived Stalingrad and were now being rushed to Normandy to kill Americans and British troops. If this train reached the coast, thousands of Allied soldiers would die. Virginie stood on Platform 6, staring at the monstrous convoy. The security was overwhelming. SS guards patrolled every car. Machine gun nests had been set up at both ends of the platform. The station had been locked down. No civilians allowed, only essential German personnel and collaborationist railway workers. Michel appeared beside her, his face pale. "You can't," he said. "It's suicide." "Then I die," Virginie replied. "But that train doesn't leave. They'll shoot you on sight." "Maybe." She handed him a folded letter. "If I don't come back, give this to my sister." Before he could argue, she walked toward the train. Her plan was insane, reckless, and depended entirely on German overconfidence. She was betting that in the chaos of D-Day, in the panic of a failing invasion defense, no one would question a Red Cross nurse doing her job. She carried her medical bag openly, walking with brisk, professional purpose toward the troop cars. An SS officer stepped in front of her, rifle raised. "Halt! Wo gehst du hin?" "Halt! Where are you going?" Virginie held up her bag. "Medical supplies for the soldiers," she said in German. "They requested morphine and bandages for the journey." The officer hesitated. He looked at her armband, her exhausted face, the bag that clearly contained medical equipment. "Schnell!" he barked. "Quickly." He let her pass. Virginie moved along the length of the train, her heart screaming in her chest. She stopped at the junction between the 9th and 10th freight cars, crouching as if to adjust her shoe. Her hand slipped into her coat pocket, withdrew not one vial, but 3. Every grain of sand she had left. She poured them all into the wheel housing, one after another, emptying every vial until nothing remained. Then she stood, walked calmly back toward the station exit, and disappeared into the night. Convoy 880 departed Lyon at 10:17 p.m., rolling northwest toward Normandy at maximum speed. The soldiers inside sang marching songs. The officers checked their maps, calculating arrival times, planning tactics. At 11:43 p.m., 68 kilometers outside Lyon, the 9th freight car began to smoke. By 11:51 p.m., the bearing had seized. The axle snapped. The car derailed, dragging 3 others with it and blocking the tracks completely. The SS Panzer Division that was supposed to reach Normandy in 18 hours was stranded in the French countryside for 6 days, while engineers cleared the wreckage and repaired the line. By the time they finally arrived at the coast, the Allies had already secured their beachhead. Virginie never knew the exact impact of that single act of sabotage. She didn't know how many Allied soldiers lived because a German tank division arrived too late to crush them on the beaches. But historians would later estimate that the coordinated railway sabotage operations across France, Plan Vert, delayed German reinforcements by an average of 5 to 7 days, giving the Allies the critical window they needed to survive the first week of the invasion. And somewhere in that chaos, buried in the statistics of derailed trains and delayed divisions, was Convoy 880, stopped by 3 tablespoons of sand, and a nurse who refused to be invisible anymore. The next morning, Virginie burned her coat, buried the empty vials in the riverbank, and reported for her shift, as if nothing had happened. The Gestapo came for her 3 days later. Not because they suspected her, because someone somewhere had finally broken under torture and given up a name. But by then it didn't matter. The invasion had succeeded. The liberation of France had begun. And Virginie d'Alberlac, the invisible saboteur, had already won. They arrested her on a Tuesday, and by Friday she had vanished into the machine that swallowed people whole and never gave them back. June 9th, 1944, 6:17 a.m. Virginie was walking to the station for her morning shift when 2 men in leather coats stepped out of a doorway. No words, no warnings, just hands gripping her arms, a black car idling at the curb, the door slamming shut before she could scream. Avenue Berthelot. The building everyone whispered about, but no one looked at directly. The place where Simone had died, where 100 others had died, where the walls themselves seemed to remember every scream. They threw her into a windowless cell that smelled of blood and disinfectant. The interrogation began immediately. The Gestapo officer who questioned her was methodical, almost bored. He knew her name, her address, her work schedule. He knew about Michel, Etienne, Claude. Someone had talked, probably under torture, probably while begging for death. "We know you sabotaged German trains," he said in perfect French, lighting a cigarette. "We have a witness. Sign the confession, and you'll be sent to a work camp. Refuse, and we do this the hard way." Virginie said nothing. She had made herself a promise weeks ago. If they caught her, she would not break. She would not give them the satisfaction of hearing her beg, would not betray anyone still fighting, would not die as anything less than what she had become, a soldier in an invisible war. The officer sighed, as if disappointed by her stubbornness, and gestured to the guards. The torture lasted 3 days. They used techniques perfected over years of occupation. Electric shocks, near drowning, stress positions that made your bones feel like they were tearing through your skin. They screamed questions at her between the pain, demanding names, locations, methods. She gave them nothing. On the 3rd day, something unexpected happened. The interrogation stopped, not because she had broken, but because the city itself was breaking. Outside the walls of Avenue Berthelot, the liberation of France was accelerating. Allied forces were pushing inland from Normandy. The Free French Army was marching north from the Mediterranean. And across Lyon, the German occupation was collapsing. Railway workers, emboldened by the success of Plan Vert, had gone from sabotage to open strike. Trains sat idle on platforms. German officers screamed orders that no one followed. The city was grinding to a halt, and the Gestapo, once omnipotent, was suddenly vulnerable. On June 12th, a German officer burst into Virginie's cell. He didn't interrogate her. He just stared, his face pale with something that looked almost like fear. "You've won," he said in German. "I hope you're proud." Then he left. The door stayed unlocked. Virginie waited for a trap, for guards to return, for one final bullet. But the building was emptying. She could hear boots running in the hallways above, orders being shouted, files being burned. The Gestapo was evacuating. She stumbled out of the cell, her body broken, but her mind intact. She dragged herself through the corridors, past abandoned interrogation rooms, past blood-stained walls, and out into the blinding sunlight of a June afternoon in a city teetering on the edge of freedom. Lyon was liberated on September 3rd, 1944. American troops rolled into the city to cheering crowds throwing flowers and wine. Collaborators were dragged into the streets and beaten. German prisoners were marched past burned-out railway stations and derailed trains, evidence of the resistance that had bled them for years. Virginie watched the celebration from a distance, her body still healing, her mind struggling to process the fact that she had survived. The network was gone. Simone was dead. Etienne had been arrested 2 weeks after Virginie and shot in a field outside the city. Claude had disappeared. No one knew if he had fled or been killed. Only Michel remained, gray-haired and hollow-eyed, a ghost of the man who had first taught her about sand and bearings. When the new French government began cataloging resistance activities, Virginie filled out the paperwork mechanically. Name, activities, dates. She listed the trains she had sabotaged, 20 in total, though she suspected there were more she didn't know about. Derailments triggered by sand she had poured months earlier. The official response was polite but dismissive. Railway sabotage was considered support activity, not combat. Medals went to the fighters who had blown up bridges with explosives, not to nurses who had used sand. Her file was stamped, archived, and forgotten. Virginie returned to nursing. She worked in a field hospital treating wounded soldiers, then in a tuberculosis clinic, then in a small village practice far from Lyon, where no one knew her name or her history. She never spoke about the war. When people asked what she had done during the occupation, she said, "I was a nurse. I helped where I could." She married an American veteran in 1947, a quiet man who asked no questions about the scars on her wrists or the nightmares that woke her screaming. They moved to a farmhouse in the countryside, far from trains and stations, and the sound of German boots on concrete. For 40 years, Virginie d'Alberlac lived an unremarkable life. She raised chickens, she grew vegetables, she read books in the garden and listened to the radio. She never rode a train again. In 1985, a young historian named Claire Moreau was researching French railway sabotage for her doctoral thesis. She found a reference in a damaged Gestapo file, a partial list of suspected saboteurs arrested in Lyon in 1944. One name stood out: d'Alberlac, V. Nurse detained June 9th, escaped custody, June 12th. Claire tracked her down to the farmhouse. When she knocked on the door, an elderly woman answered, white-haired, stooped, eyes still sharp as broken glass. "I'm writing about the railway resistance," Claire explained. "I found your name in the archives. Were you involved?" Virginie stared at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let the historian in. They sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in 4 decades, Virginie told her story. She described the vials of sand, the 12-second window, the night she sabotaged Convoy 880, and delayed an entire panzer division. She spoke about Simone's death, Etienne's execution, the torture at Avenue Berthelot. She spoke until her voice was hoarse and her hands trembled with the weight of memory. Claire recorded everything, her pen flying across the page. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Claire asked. "You saved lives. You changed the course of the war." Virginie shook her head. "I didn't change anything. I just slowed them down. And it cost people their lives." "But you stopped the trains." "I stopped some trains," Virginie interrupted. "The rest kept rolling. The war kept grinding forward. And at the end, when it was over, no one remembered the woman who poured sand into axles. They remembered the men with explosives and guns." She looked out the window at her quiet garden, at the life she had built from the ruins of the one she had lost. "I don't need anyone to remember," she said softly. "I just needed it to matter." Claire published her thesis in 1987. It included a full chapter on Virginie's network, complete with testimonies, Gestapo records, and German army reports documenting the railway chaos that had delayed reinforcements during the critical first weeks after D-Day. The French government, embarrassed by their earlier oversight, offered Virginie a medal. She refused it. "Give it to Simone," she said. "Give it to Etienne. Give it to the people who died for this. I'm just the one who happened to survive." Virginie d'Albert-Lac died in 1997 at the age of 82. Her obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long. Former nurse, devoted wife, survived World War II. No mention of trains. No mention of sand. No mention of the 20 derailments, the delayed Panzer Division, the thousands of Allied soldiers who lived because German reinforcements arrived too late. But if you visit the Railway Museum in Lyon today, you will find a small exhibit about resistance sabotage. And in the corner, in a glass case, sits a single vial filled with sand from the Rhone River. The plaque reads, "The simplest weapons are often the most effective. This sand, poured into a single bearing, could stop a 40-ton train. Multiply that by thousands of acts of quiet defiance, and you stop an empire. No name, no photo, just sand in a bottle." Virginie would have approved. Because in the end she wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting because the trains kept rolling, and someone had to make them stop. Even if that someone was just a nurse with dirty fingernails and a pocket full of sand. Even if history forgot her name. She had won. The night Ekaterina agreed to betray her country, she did it in a hospital laundry room that smelled of blood and carbolic soap, with a German officer's pistol resting on top of a basket of dirty bandages. Riga, March 1917. The diary entry that followed the first page was dated 3 days after the studio portrait. Anna read it aloud in Irina's cramped sitting room, her voice low, the words dragging both women a century backward. March 17, 1917. They told me I had no choice. They were wrong. There is always a choice. I chose the one I could not bear, and called it duty. Ekaterina's handwriting was precise, almost cold. The story it told was anything but. She described Hospital Number 12 as Anna knew it from the archives. A converted school building, corridors choked with cots and groaning men, mud-caked boots stacked by the door, the constant stink of infection and fear. Outside, the war had ground the city into gray exhaustion. Inside, the nurses moved like ghosts in white, stitching flesh, cutting away gangrene, writing names and numbers that would outlive faces. Ekaterina had been there since 1915. She had been good at her work. Too good. The surgeons trusted her. The officers noticed her efficiency, her unflinching hands. When German shells fell closer to the city, they requested transfers to the rear. She stayed. "You have steady fingers," one colonel had said approvingly as she tied off an artery. "If you were a man, we'd send you to the artillery." She smiled politely. If she were a man, she would have been at the front already, bleeding in some other nurse's hands. The diary skimmed through those early years in a few paragraphs. The first real detail, Anna could feel the ink grow darker here, came in February 1917. February 2nd, today I received a letter from Königsberg, or rather, from what used to be my life. Ekaterina had married young, at 19, to a German engineer named Otto Weiss, whom she'd met when his firm worked on railway lines near her home. When war broke out, he had been trapped on the wrong side of the border. She had not seen him in 3 years. His family, in East Prussia, had written dutiful, careful letters at first. Then the letters had stopped. Now, in 1917, a new letter had arrived, bearing no return address. Anna's skin prickled as she read the paragraph out loud. "They have our children," Ekaterina wrote. "They do not say who they are. Perhaps they do not need to. In war, they is always the side that holds the gun. 2 children. My Anna, 8, who used to sleep with her fingers tangled in my hair. My little Joseph, 5, who still lisped his German. They will keep them safe if I help them. If not—" The sentence broke off. A blot of ink scarred the page. Beneath it, the words resumed, tighter. "Tonight a man came to the hospital. He wore a Russian officer's coat, but the accent under his perfect Russian was Prussian. He knew the names of my children. He knew the street where my in-laws' house stands. He put a photograph on the table. My children in winter coats, hands held by a stranger, whose face the censor's ink had wiped away. 'You want them to live?' he said. 'We want our men to live. Help us, Schwester. You are a practical woman.'" Anna could almost see the scene. The laundry room, steam fogging the small window, bedraggled sheets hanging like surrender flags. The officer, sitting on an upturned crate with his cap off, revealing a too neat haircut not yet ruined by the trenches. "What can I do?" I asked. I meant, what have you already decided I will do? The answer, according to the diary, had been simple. Hospital number 12 treated not only Russian soldiers, but also German prisoners, wounded men pulled from the front lines, tagged, counted, and meant to be shipped deeper into Russia once they healed. The laundry room had an exterior door that opened onto a poorly guarded alley. A nurse with access, the German agent explained, could ensure that certain men were assigned to certain wards, moved on certain nights, bundled into certain laundry carts that left by that back door. In exchange, the agent had said, "Your children will be moved from the camp to my sister's house. They will be safe. When the war ends, you will be reunited." Ekaterina had laughed in his face, according to her entry. "When the war ends," I said. "You and I both know one of us will not be alive when that happens." The man had not smiled. He had simply placed his pistol on the basket of bloody bandages between them. "This is not a negotiation," he had said. "This is a test. If you pass, your children eat. If you fail—" He glanced at the door. "There are those in your army who already suspect you, Frau Weiss. Or should I say, Sister Volkova." He knew about her marriage, about Otto, about the German surname she had dropped the moment war began. "Someone in this room is already marked," Anna murmured, closing her eyes for a second. The anchor wasn't the first mark. Irina, sitting opposite on the sagging sofa, hugged a cushion to her chest. "She always said she did her best for her children," she whispered, "even when my mother called her cold." "One day," Babushka said, You will understand the price of being practical. Anna's fingers tightened on the edge of the notebook. Back in 1917, Ekaterina had stared at the pistol. Then she had stared at the photograph of her children. I have assisted at amputations, she wrote. I have held men down while their limbs were cut without anesthetic. There is a moment when the bone resists the saw, a hard crunch. That is what this felt like, inside my chest. She had picked up the photograph first, slid it back into her apron. Then she had picked up the pistol, turned it once in her hand, and set it gently back on the basket. This time, closer to the German. I will help you, she had said. But not for your country. For my children. Don't mistake those things. The man's smile, she noted with surgeon's precision, did not reach his eyes. He told her the rules. She would be given lists of prisoner numbers. Men on those lists were to be misplaced, recorded as transferred, but instead diverted to the laundry corridor on specific nights. Outside contacts would handle the rest. She was never to ask names or destinations. Her job was logistics, nothing more. As a sign of commitment, he produced a small case and a needle. The anchor, Anna said under her breath, fingertips tracing the margin where ink had seeped through as if from a painful memory. In case our people need to recognize you, the agent had explained. There are others like you, sister. You are not alone. He tattooed me himself, Ekaterina wrote. A German officer in a Russian coat, pushing a needle into my skin while I bit my tongue so I would not scream. I thought of my children and counted each stab as a day stolen back from death. When it was done, the anchor bled under my skin. Now you are marked, he said. He was wrong. I have been marked since I first kissed a foreigner and thought love could survive a border. Anna realized her own forearm hurt. She had been clenching it unconsciously. She exhaled slowly. Irina's cheeks were wet. She did it for them, she said. For my grandmother. For a chance they would live. If you are a mother. Anna nodded. It changes what treason means. But the diary didn't let them romanticize it. March 23rd. First transfer, Ekaterina wrote. 3 prisoners from Ward B, numbers only. 1 had eyes like Otto's. I told myself that meant nothing. I arranged the charts so they appeared ready for transport. At midnight, when the ward slept, I moved them to the laundry corridor. I told the orderly they needed delousing. When I opened the outside door, 2 shadows detached from the snow. They spoke German. The men followed them without question. I closed the door and cleaned the floor where their boots had wet it. In the morning, their beds were empty. The matron cursed the record-keeping. I said nothing. No heroics, no speeches, just quiet, terrifying efficiency. In the margins, in smaller, almost cramped script, Ekaterina added, I vomited in the latrine afterward, not from guilt, from the realization that it had been easy. Anna turned the page. The next entries blurred into a pattern. Lists of numbers, quick notes about successful transfers, small observations about which officers were lazy, which orderlies could be bribed with cigarettes, which doors creaked and needed oil to avoid drawing attention. But threaded through the logistics were human details that made Anna's chest ache. Prisoner today thanked me for extra bandage, said his wife's name is Greta. Son is 6. I will never know if he lived to see them. Russian lieutenant in the next bed asked if I believed in forgiveness. I told him I believe in survival. Twice, she wrote of close calls. An officer nearly walking into the laundry corridor at the wrong time. A prisoner too weak to stand, forcing her to push the laundry cart herself, while praying no one stopped her to ask why the sheets were breathing. The moment Ekaterina realized she had been working for ghosts, she was standing in a Riga telegraph office with her hands still stained by Russian blood and German ink. Anna read the line twice to be sure she hadn't misunderstood. August 1917, the diary said. They told me today that my children are safe. I know now this means they are dead. The pages between March and August were a ledger of treason and arithmetic. Each entry was clinical, almost surgical. April 2nd, 4 men, Ward C, numbers 7113, 7119, 7140, 7142. Transfer successful, no questions. May 19th, major inspection. Hid 1 prisoner in linen cart during head count. Heart did not slow for 2 hours after. June 7th, 9 men. 1 begged me not to send him. Said he feared crossing no man's land more than Russian camp. I sent him anyway. Remember this when you judge me. Next to that last line, in the margin, Anna saw something unusual. 3 deep gouges where the pen had torn the page. Irina noticed it too. She pressed too hard, she whispered. Or she wanted the paper to scream, Anna said. Out loud, she kept reading. The work had accelerated after April. Once every few weeks became once a week, then several times a week. Hospital number 12 was a crossroads now, a place where men changed not just bandages, but allegiances and destinations. The German agent in the Russian coat returned only twice. Most of the time, Ekaterina dealt with anonymous notes slipped under laundry baskets, lists of numbers written in a careful, impersonal hand. In May, the diary recorded the first consequences. May 27th, they found the gap in the transport lists. Special department sent inspectors. 1 young lieutenant from Petrograd asked to see me privately. He laid out the paperwork. He had done his homework. You sign many transfer forms, Sister Volkova, he said. More than others. His eyes were kind. That made it worse. I told him the truth that would save my life, that I am efficient and do not complain. He marked something in his file and warned me that any further irregularities would be investigated. I think he wanted to help me. If he knew how, he would hate himself for it. 2 weeks later, that same lieutenant appeared again in the diary, this time on a stretcher, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. June 12th. Today the inspector returned without his uniform jacket and without his questions. We opened his body and tried to keep his insides from sliding onto the floor. While I held the retractor, he gripped my wrist, the one with the anchor, and whispered, "Do you ever feel like the earth is eating us?" I told him to save his strength. He died that night. They buried him with honors. No one ever read the file he kept on me. War is a clumsy censor. Anna paused. She knew exactly which lives bought her more time, she said softly. Irina's eyes glistened. And she wrote it down, she murmured. She wanted us to know every ugly part. The entries for July turned darker. July 3rd. Rumors of revolution spreading from Petrograd. Men argue politics between morphine doses. Some praise the Tsar, some curse him. Some say Germany will save us from ourselves. I no longer care who rules. I only care who writes to Königsberg. July 18th, I sent 11 men tonight. I did not learn their names. I am grateful for this. Then came August 1917. August 21st. Riga evacuation order. Germans advancing, chaos. Files burned, beds emptied, carts loaded with the barely living and the half-dead. Perfect cover for one last message. I went to the telegraph office with official evacuation papers in one hand and my private death sentence in the other. Here, Ekaterina switched to present tense, as if the memory still burned. I write, to Frau Weiss Königsberg, urgent. Have you seen our children? Reply condition current. I pay with the few rubles I have. Telegraph clerk barely glances at me. Outside, artillery sounds like furniture being dragged across the sky. 3 days later, the reply came, not from Königsberg, but from Berlin. The text was short, bureaucratic, and annihilating. Children evacuated 1915 from Königsberg to East Prussian refugee column. Column attacked by Russian cavalry near Augustu. Casualties heavy. No surviving records of miners' haze. The name had been scratched out so violently that the paper tore. Below it, Ekaterina had rewritten the key sentence in Russian. They died 2 years ago, Anna translated quietly. Before the first letter, before the anchor, before any of this. The next line, alone on the page, was written in a shaking hand. I have been trading men's lives for graves. Irina sucked in a breath like she'd been punched. They lied to her from the beginning. Anna nodded. They used children who were already dead to buy soldiers who were still alive. The diary did not indulge in breakdown. Ekaterina didn't describe screaming or tears. She simply turned the revelation into a new kind of mathematics. From this day, she wrote, I no longer work for them. I will still move men, but I will decide who and why. If I must damn myself, it will be for my own reasons, not for the lies of men in clean uniforms. The hospital's evacuation gave her that chance. With fronts collapsing and orders changing hourly, the ledger of who should go where turned to soup. She used the confusion like a scalpel. August 30th. 2 lists tonight. German wants officers, 3002, 3011, 3020. I have seen these men. One boasted about burning a Polish village. Another laughed when a nurse dropped a tray from fear of bombardment. On second list, Russian prisoners the Germans plan to shoot before retreat. Boys, 17, 18. I swap numbers. Monsters to firing squad, boys to laundry door. If there is justice, it will not come from flags. Anna felt a chill run down her back. She's not just a courier anymore, she murmured. She's judge and executioner. The next entries confirmed it. September 2nd. For the first time, I send Russians through the laundry door. Not to the Germans, to the forest. Partisans have men there. A Latvian orderly, Janis, contacts them. We empty a whole wagon, meant for a mass grave. Ekaterina had turned the same mechanism the Germans built into a double-edged knife. Prisoners went missing, but not always in the direction Berlin intended. September 10th. The German comes back, furious. You play games with lists, he says. We required officers. We received peasants. I show him evacuation chaos, burned records, wounded pouring in. I show him my blood-soaked apron. You think I have time to play games? I ask. He presses the pistol to my anchor. Do not forget what is on the other end of our wires, he whispers. I do not tell him I have already cut those wires in my heart. The escalation couldn't last. Someone always notices when the numbers don't add up. October 1st. Special department again. New man this time, sharp as a scalpel. He spreads transport lists on the desk and circles dates. On these nights, someone interfered, he says. On these nights, prisoners disappeared from both sides. He looks at my wrist. On these nights, sister, you were on duty. She did what she had done before, lied with just enough truth to pass. I am always on duty, I tell him. War does not follow schedules. He does not smile. He writes, anchor, confirmed, in his notebook. Anna looked up at Irina. That's the same phrase the German wrote in her diary, she said. Two enemies, seeing the same mark, naming it the same way. Both thinking they owned her, Irina said bitterly. The last part of the combined chapter came fast, the handwriting slanting, the dates closer together. October 12th. Rumors. Germans will take Riga completely. Hospital will be overrun. They will not forgive what I have done to their lists. Russians will not forgive either. There is no army left for me. October 20th. Janice says there is a way out. Through Finland, then to Sweden. From there, perhaps to Germany, perhaps nowhere. He says I should run. I ask him, to what? He says, to a life where no one orders you who must die. I almost laugh. There is no such place. October 23rd. I dream of Anna and Joseph. In the dream, they stand on the Augusto Road, holding hands. Snow falls, but does not touch them. Behind them, men without faces march through smoke. I wake with blood on my tongue. I have bitten it in my sleep. The very last entry that Anna and Irina read that evening carried a date that made both of them glance up in unison. November 7th, 1917. Petrograd has exploded. They say the government has fallen. Red flags, gunfire, chaos. On the same day, I board a freight car north with forged papers. From Janice. I am no longer Nurse Volkova or Frau Weiss. I am just a woman with a suitcase that smells of carbolic and guilt. A line had been drawn under the paragraph. Under it, in smaller, cramped letters, Ekaterina added, "If I reach Germany, I will find the graves. If I do not, let whoever finds this know. I was not loyal to any flag. I was loyal to two children who never got the chance to betray anyone." Anna closed the diary and sat very still. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The only sound was the muffled radio from a neighbor's kitchen and the distant rumble of St. Petersburg traffic. Finally, Irina broke the silence. "So in Russia," she said slowly, "they filed her as a traitor. In Germany, they used her until she was useless. And in our family, she became a closed suitcase no one dared to touch." "And on paper," Anna added, thinking of the Tsarist file. "She's just one more name on a list of suspects with an anchor tattoo." "But in reality," Irina said, looking at the young woman in the photograph on the table, "she was a mother trying to buy back time that was already gone." Anna nodded. "And now," she said, "we have to find out what happened after that freight car. Whether she ever found those graves, and whether someone on the other side of the war remembers the woman with the anchor for something other than treason. Because if Ekaterina's story ended in a forest or a nameless camp ditch, the diary was a confession. But if it tangled with someone else's records, German, Swedish, maybe even Jewish or Polish prisoner files, it could become something more dangerous. Evidence. The first person to say Ekaterina's name with gratitude instead of accusation did it from a wheelchair, staring at a faded hospital photograph in a German archive that shouldn't have existed. Berlin, 2020. 3 months after opening the suitcase, Anna finally stood in front of the Bundesarchive's reading room window, watching drizzle streak across the glass. On the table behind her lay copies of Ekaterina's diary pages, carefully translated, and a short, nervous email she had sent a week earlier to a historian she had never met. Dr. Lucas Hartmann specialized in German POW escapes during World War I. His reply to Anna's summary of the diary had been immediate and unnervingly precise. "I believe I have a man who matches your nurse," he had written. "Come to Berlin. Bring the anchor." Now he wheeled himself into the reading room. Early 40s, lean, hair streaked prematurely gray, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had made peace with his chair years ago. "You must be Anna," he said, switching from German to Russian, with only a hint of an accent. "And you must be a Katerina." He nodded toward the photograph she'd placed on the table, the young nurse with the anchor visible on her wrist. Anna sat opposite him, heart pounding. "You said you had something." "I have a puzzle piece," Lucas said. "And your diary might be the missing edge." He opened a folder on his lap and laid out a series of documents, typewritten reports, crude maps, and finally a list titled Betreff. Bericht über erfolgreiche Entweichung deutscher Kriegsgefangener aus russischen Lazaretten 1917-1918. Report on successful escapes of German POWs from Russian hospitals, he translated. Compiled in 1920 by the Reichsarchiv. I've been working with this for years. Most cases are anonymous. But one stands out. He tapped a paragraph halfway down the page. Case 17. Riga. March-June, 1917. 24 men extracted from Hospital Número 12 with assistance of embedded asset codename Anchor, asset believed to be female medical staff with access to patient records and external service entrance. Identity unknown following chaos of front collapse. Lucas looked up. I always assumed anchor was metaphorical, a safe point. I never thought it might be literal ink on skin. Anna exhaled slowly. She calls herself nothing in the diary, she said. But the Germans, the Russians, they both wrote anchor when they noted her. They branded her with the same word. Lucas nodded. Here's the interesting part. He pulled out a second sheet, older, edges browned. Testimony from one of those prisoners, given in 1961, when the West German government conducted interviews with surviving World War I veterans. The heading read, Erinnerungen von Obergefreiter Karl Meissner, Gebier, 1897. Private First Class Karl Meissner, Lucas said. Captured near Duneberg, wounded, sent to a Russian hospital in Riga, escaped. I've read this 100 times. Listen to this section. He slid the document toward Anna and pointed. I was lying in a ward that smelled of rot and disinfectant. The testimony read in stiff, bureaucratic German. We had heard rumors that some prisoners were being smuggled out, but you never believed such things. Then one night a nurse came to my bed with a laundry cart. She told me, in bad German, if you want to see your mother again, get in. I thought it was a joke. Then she pulled up her sleeve and showed me a small anchor tattoo on her wrist. Remember this, she said. If you live, remember, there was at least one Russian woman who did